Gluttony seems to be a sin that so many in the church avoid talking about. And it's easy to see why. Because we live in a culture, at least in the West, where gluttony has become the norm, both in the world and in the church. But this is a sin, nothing less, that needs not to be ignored. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Another reason gluttony may not be discussed is because there are few places in Scripture where it appears. But just because of that doesn't mean that this sin should be ignored. 2 Timothy 3:16 says that all Scripture, all of it, not some, is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness. And what it says of gluttony is no exception. So let's look at what the Bible has to say on this subject. Before we do, we need to define gluttony. According to the dictionary, gluttony is overindulgence. At the heart of covetousness is greed. It is wanting more than we need. Gluttony is not particularly an eating problem, although it could result in such. Gluttony is a heart problem. It's not about what you eat, though that is important. It's about the attitude in which you do so. It isn't a bad thing when you eat to satisfy your hunger. It becomes a sin when you eat to gratify your heart of greed. You know what I'm talking about. You want it not because you're hungry. You want it because you're driven by selfishness. Let's look at what the Scripture says about this now. Proverbs 23 has a few things to say about gluttony. There are two places where we see this most clearly. So let's look at these verses, then we'll discuss them. In verse 2, we're given some pretty strong words against the danger of giving in to your flesh's appetite.
When you sit down to eat with a ruler, consider carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are a man given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food.
This verse isn't necessarily telling us not to eat. What it is saying is that we should be careful not to let our indulgence cloud out our thinking. In the Hebrew, the word appetite here comes from the word nefesh, referring to a person's being, self or emotions. So essentially, what this verse is saying here is to be careful not to let your emotions affect your judgment, which is what verse 3 says. Do not desire his delicacies, for it is deceptive food. The problem is not so much with the action as it is with the desire. That's the danger of gluttony. It impacts not only your body, but your discernment as well.
Do not mix with winebibbers, or with gluttonous eaters of meat. For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe a man with rags.
There may be some who are given to gluttony who aren't exactly impoverished. But the principle here is this. Gluttony causes drowsiness, or laziness, which leads down a road to poverty. Gluttony is not merely overindulgence. It is idolatry, because you are serving the god of your belly. And this is a sin God takes seriously. So seriously that those who practice this are seen as his enemies. Look at what Philippians 3:18 and 19 says.
For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things.
So this isn't something to be taken lightly. I hope this video has helped you to see the importance of abstaining from this sin, and to learn to live with more of a grateful heart. Because gluttony is at its core greed, so be careful of where your heart is when you're tempted to give in to the selfish sin of gluttony.